Okay, so the U.S. politics issue, that's going to be where this plays out in the near future. So the Congress is going to be pushing more and more towards war, and McKinley will as well, even though he is going at it a bit more slowly. He's cautious. U.S. business interests, for the most part, aren't um, interested in intervention. They think it would be bad for business, and so they're pushing back. And there's just a number of skeptics in society, especially people who have a good bit of influence. But more and more people who do have influence are going to be pushing for intervention. So a lot of religious leaders are pushing for intervention. They see it as a humanitarian effort that the U.S. can be involved in that could really be something that they should be involved in morally, that as a country that they should be involved in this. There was I believe it was a U.S. representative, congressional representative that visited Cuba, if I remember correctly. I've forgotten his name, but basically he came back, and unlike the sensationalism that you saw in the newspapers, he was able to report on the devastation and the suffering in very real terms, and that event actually got a lot of people, especially like Wall Street, but business people, on board with the idea of intervention versus trying to continue to work with Spain. And with that, the religious push and just the general push in society, very well, not slowly, but McKinley gets more and more on board, and soon he will seek defense appropriations from Congress, so about $50 million, and he ends up sending an ultimatum to Spain, saying, you are going to have to make a choice here. Either you're going to have to fight us, or you're going to declare a ceasefire with the independence of Cuba as the primary objective, because that's our goal. Our goal is an independent Cuba. And Spain, for its part, really isn't ready for a fight with the U.S. They are not militarily, ready for that, set up for that, and the U.S. isn't, on board with just sending out a massive military force either. But they're more in. One, it's way closer to the U.S., and so that's easier, and two, they can muster the resources a bit more quickly that they need, and so. And in Spain, another issue was that their public wasn't prepared for the loss. They weren't aware of the problems or the possibility of losing Cuba, like you might think that they would, compared to what's going on in the U.S. And so there's a concern there that if Cuba is lost, it would be such a PR disaster, of people looking so bad for the monarchy, that the monarchy might actually fall. Like there would be a downfall of the monarchy, and they would be replaced because of mismanagement, basically. And so they actually end up offering a ceasefire as but with Cuba remaining part of the empire, again, similar to what they'd offered before. But the U.S. is adamant on an independent Cuba, and so that's where they, continue on. And so, on April 11th, McKinley gives a special message to Congress saying the war in Cuba must stop, and he asks Congress for the authority to use the armed forces to secure a full and final termination of hostilities between the government of Spain and the people of Cuba. And so the Congress passes a number of resolutions to that effect, and Spain cuts off its diplomatic relations with the United States. And then on April 24th, Spain declares war. On April 25th, the United States officially declares war. And so now, the United States, this upstart power in the world, and Spain, the old guard, the original of the European colonial powers, are at war. And so it's a really interesting dichotomy or matchup here between these two very different powers, and how is that going to work out? And so it's going to be as far as wars go, relatively short affair, 114 days. Neither side is particularly prepared, as I said, but the U.S. is going to be in a position to win very relatively easily. The one area that the U.S. could field a good bit of strength was in naval power. They had 4 new battleships. It was the Indiana, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Oregon. They were ready to go, and they were well supplied and could be put into play quickly. And that was just on the Atlantic side. On the Pacific side, the U.S. forces are strong there as well. They had ships in place, they had plenty of supply, and were ready to go, basically. And a lot of that was due to Theodore Roosevelt. He was the Secretary of the Navy at the time, and had pushed for readiness, basically, pushed for a strengthening of the Navy. He had always been a proponent of naval power. That was the source of British power throughout the 1800s, and he knew the U.S. needed that as well. And so with what resources he had made sure that the U.S. Navy was ready, and so they were able to deploy that rather quickly into the fight. TR is also going to be joining. He gets himself into a position where he can be on the ground in Cuba, and he becomes part of a cavalry unit, or leads a cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, and it's a pretty legendary or famous group that is involved in the fight. Have a famous charge up San Juan Hill. It ends up not being San Juan Hill, but that's what it's called. And so if you want to learn more about that, I'm going to link a video below where an expert on that has written a book on that. It talks about TR and the Rough Riders and what all went on with them, because it's kind of its own story in all of this process. So the first engagement for the U.S. and the Spanish is going to be at Manila in the Pacific, and that's going to be a fairly easy affair. The U.S. Navy there is going to be able to bombard the Spanish ships that are anchored there in the harbor, and then rather quickly they're able to take that port. And then on the Atlantic side, in the Caribbean, the Spanish end up sending 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers to Cuba, and they're able to sort of stay out of sight for a little bit. But once the U.S. figures out where they are able to blockade that particular port, kind of keep them locked down. And it's not until the Spanish basically kind of make a run for it along the coast, and the U.S. forces end up bombarding those ships as well, and they end up either beached or sunk. And that fleet is basically put out of commission rather quickly with very few losses or damage to the U.S. And so the U.S. lands ground forces in Cuba, they land ground forces in Puerto Rico, and they're going to land ground forces in the Philippines and Guam in short order. And the U.S. is going to be able to win decisive battles in rather quickly. Some people actually called it a splendid little war. I forget the where that phrase started, but that was what it became known as. There's actually I think books written about the Spanish-American War that are titled "The Splendid Little War," because that was as such a usually that's not a term applied to a conflict, but here it was the case. Puerto Rico is taken with very little resistance, so most of the actual fighting happens on Cuba, but it doesn't last particularly long. And so by July, the Spanish are asking via France for a ceasefire, and that is granted, and then the peace talks are going to happen over the next several months, and it won't be the Treaty of Paris. There's been many a Treaty of Paris, but this Treaty of Paris is going to be signed in December. So it's going to be a long process, but essentially the war is wrapped up there in the summer. The human cost to the war is going to be about 60,000 for the Spanish in total. So disease and war, it's hard to separate those two a lot of times. The U.S., at least, for the U.S., we have the numbers. The U.S. loses 5,462. 379 were lost to the actual fighting. The rest were to disease because they're fighting in a tropical climate that they're not used to, and so that is a recipe for disaster for them. And so, not heavy losses at all in the grand scheme of things when it comes to fighting between two major countries as far as the U.S. is concerned. The territorial losses, I had them back here on this one. So Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam. Spain, on the part of the Philippines, felt that it should be compensated something like $20 million for the facilities that it had built in the Philippines, and believe the U.S. actually ended up paying a price. I forget if it was actually $20 million, but it was a substantial sum for the Philippines, in addition to having won the fight. So these negotiations work out oddly sometimes. Much of the Cuban Liberation Army was actually taken out of the fights, which has always been a sore point for Cubans, in that they had carried on this fight for a long time, and then the U.S. gets there, and all of a sudden they're just not, you're cutting them out basically, and not being allowed to carry on. A lot of that had to do with racial issues. The blacks and mulattoes were a heavy part of that Liberation Army, and so with the racial problems that come out of the U.S. in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're looking at a situation where they don't want to be involved with that army, and it ends up being a mostly just U.S. led effort. McKinley saw this taking over of these territories as, sorry, I always hit that wrong, as benevolent assimilation. Some of his writings show a mix of national glory, commerce. All these things are sort of swirling, and nobody has a one thing that they're shooting for. So national glory, commerce is one. Racial superiority, especially in the Philippines, is a major issue. Believing that they're not capable of self-government. Christian altruism, so that whole Christianization thing is still an issue there, and something that gets brought up a lot. And the Philippines is going to be a particular issue because that's going to carry on as a guerrilla war for another 3 years. The Filipinos don't want the U.S. there, and so the U.S. is going to be in a position kind of like Spain was in Cuba, where they're trying to put down rebellions, and this constant struggle there is going to be one that carries on. And so let me pause here, and then I'll be right back to do a quick wrap up.